Hello everyone and welcome to Royalty Now, where we bring you face-to-face with figures from the past. King Henry VIII is one of the most well-known figures in English history, famous for his 6 wives. But he's also known for his illustrious portraiture. Today, we'll dive into Henry's appearance and reveal some lifelike recreations at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. Prince Henry of England was never intended to be the king. He was born in 1491. The second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. We may even have one early glimpse at the face of a young Henry. This kind of creepy terracotta bust of a smiling 7-year-old child is reportedly an image of Henry. The coloring certainly matches, with his red gold hair and fair complexion the gift of his mother, Elizabeth of York. We can also see similarities in the small eyes, plump cheeks, and button nose that appear later on portraits of the king. While the identification of this bust is tenuous, it was only a few years after this image was made that Henry learned he would someday be king. At just the age of 10, Henry's older brother Arthur died, thrusting all of his duties and unfulfilled potential onto the young prince. Our first confirmed look at Henry is this portrait, made in 1509 of the 18-year-old prince. It was painted the same year as his wedding to Catherine of Aragon. But it looks distinctly different from images of Henry later in his life. This could be because of the absence of propaganda that we see later in Henry's images, how he purposely makes himself look large and grandiose in later portraits. Or it could be because this early Tudor artist wasn't as skilled at capturing Henry's appearance. Either way, nearly all contemporary descriptions of a young King Henry are incredibly favorable. By the summer of 1509, Henry was crowned the King of England. In the beginning of his reign, he was seen as England's new Renaissance ruler. Virtuous, handsome, and brimming with new ideas for education and religious reforms. His court was bright and loud, filled with dancing, jousting, and court pageants. Venetian Ambassador Giustinian wrote in 1515 that Henry was most excellent in his personal endowments and likewise gifted with mental accomplishments. Henry could speak multiple languages, play numerous instruments, even writing his own music. At 23 years old, Henry was around 6'2" and 200 pounds, with a muscular frame and a broad chest. Keeping him in good shape was his love of everything sport: hunting, jousting, archery, and even tennis, with one ambassador stating that King Henry was the prettiest thing in the world to see play, and another saying that he was much handsomer than any other sovereign in Christendom. For much of his life, Henry wore his bright auburn hair combed straight and short in the French fashion, and wore a short beard that one observer described as looking like gold. His wardrobe was also sumptuous, adding to his overall splendor. Henry loved clothes and hardly ever wore the same garment twice. The fabrics, dyes, and jewels used to make them were internationally sourced and imported just for him. Unfortunately, we don't have many portraits of Henry from this prime time in his life, with the exception of this version by an unknown artist, painted in 1520 as a pair with his wife, Catherine. Just like the version of Henry at 18, this portrait lacks realism and it looks cartoonish. One reason for this is that it may be what's known as a pattern portrait. A pattern portrait is a set likeness of the monarch that is shared between artist studios. But since artists are not all equally skilled, each time the likeness is shared and copied, it ends up losing something of the original, like playing a game of telephone with Henry's face. Therefore, we can't really rely on any of these to be a true likeness of the king. It's around the 1530s that we get the most lifelike portraits of Henry, showing his small blue eyes, long, slightly hooked nose, small mouth, and round face. This portrait is one of my favorites. Henry would be about 40 years old here. In 1533, the king would become acquainted with a German artist named Hans Holbein, and he made him his court painter, possibly at the urging of his new wife, Anne Boleyn. Holbein was immensely more talented than any other artist in England, with some of his paintings looking more like photographs than portraits. The king would sit for Holbein in 1536, giving us a much more realistic look at Henry than any other portraits made of him until this point. Sadly, one of the most accurate and renowned portraits of King Henry by Holbein has been lost to history. We only know of its existence through preparatory sketches and copies made by other artists. The massive, life-size portrait, which was a family image depicting Henry, his parents, and his wife at the time, Jane Seymour, burned down with Whitehall Palace in 1698. It's thought that this image was the genesis of the classic, propagandistic portrait of Henry VIII, where he stands tall and imposing, facing the viewer square on, in his huge cloak and obvious codpiece. In reality, Henry was beginning to lose his intimidation factor. Although he stood 6 foot 2 inches tall, very large for the time, in 1536 Henry had suffered severe injuries in a jousting accident, which would leave him unconscious for multiple hours and leave him with a leg wound that would never really heal. Still continuing to eat and drink like he used to, with little to no activity, Henry soon gained a massive amount of weight. By his 50s, he was almost 400 pounds. He was also nearly bald, carefully hiding his head under hats in every portrait. Suits of armor from 1544 show his size, and we can see the evolution of his suits of armor and his measurements throughout his life in this fascinating image. After this accident, we have no more life portraits of Henry VIII, just copies of the lost originals, churned out to the people of England as propaganda reminders of their once-beloved king. So, let's take a look at some recreations of Henry, from his handsome youth to his later years. For the young version, I'm using the features of the lifelike 1530s images and aging them down slightly so that we can get an image of Henry in his prime. So let's take a look now.